The inheritance waiver slid across the glass tabletop, its sharp corner stopping just inches from the toe of my tactical boots. The chemical-laden scent of apple cinnamon candles in my mother's multi-million-dollar mansion hit my nostrils, making my stomach churn. My name is Lola Lane, 32 years old, and a captain in the United States Army Corps of Engineers. 3 civil lawyers sat with their legs crossed on the Italian leather sofa, the rhythmic tapping of their Mont Blanc pens waiting for my signature. Richard, my stepfather, swirled a glass of red wine, looking at me as if I were a pest. My mother pushed the paper another inch forward and said, "Sign it, Lola. The Army pays you peanuts. Take this 20% and pay off your mortgage. Do not make it awkward for the family." They thought a daughter who had been discarded for 20 years would obediently bow down for a few scraps. They have no idea I brought the rules of engagement with me. Before I tear down their hypocritical facade with the very traps my father left behind, let me know where you are watching this video from in the comments. Hit the like button and subscribe if you have ever been turned on by your own blood over money. This is how a soldier clears a family minefield. I pressed the heel of my dirt-caked tactical boots into the pristine cream-colored Persian rug, watching the expensive fibers flatten and stain under the weight of my combat gear. The Porter mansion always smelled the same, a nauseating blend of synthetic apple cinnamon candles and the sharp metallic scent of high-end floor wax. It was a smell that tried too hard to whisper home while screaming status. The central air was humming, pinned at a steady 68 degrees, but a thin layer of cold sweat was already mapping its way down my spine. I scanned the room with the practiced efficiency of a captain in the Corps of Engineers. I wasn't just looking at furniture, I was marking targets. 3 men in identical navy suits sat on the Italian leather sofa, their briefcases unzipped and spilling over with red-tabbed folders. My mother, Diane, was perched in her wing-back chair, smoothing an invisible wrinkle on her silk dress as if my presence was just another smudge to be wiped away. Richard, my stepfather, stood by the fake fireplace, turning a chrome wine opener in his hand like a miniature weapon. Nobody offered me a seat. From the window to the coffee table was exactly 6 paces. There was no rear exit. I could feel the pressure of their collective silence pushing against my chest, a tactical envelopment designed to make me feel small. The lawyer in the middle, a man named Stevens, cleared his throat and slid a thick stack of papers across the glass tabletop. The sound of paper scraping against glass was like a razor blade on skin. He tapped his index finger twice on the bolded heading, Waiver of Inheritance Rights. He didn't look me in the eye when he spoke. "Captain Lane," he said, his voice as smooth and artificial as the fireplace logs. "We all understand the weight of your loss. However, the financial records indicate that Thomas Lane showed significant signs of cognitive decline in his final months. My client, Diane, is suggesting an 80-20 split to avoid a public trial that would unfortunately expose your father's mental instability to the community." He pushed a Mont Blanc fountain pen toward me. It rolled across the glass with a hollow, rhythmic sound, stopping right next to the waiver. I stared at the white space on that paper, my jaw locking so tight it felt like it might crack. The unfairness of it tasted like bitter copper in the back of my throat. My father, Thomas, had spent 40 years as a carpenter, building half the houses in this county with hands that were always stained with cedar and sweat. To hear this man in a $1,000 suit talk about his instability felt like a physical blow to my stomach. My mother leaned forward then, and the heavy scent of Chanel No. 5 hit me like a wall. She reached out and placed her hand over mine, her manicured acrylic nails digging into the scarred skin of my knuckles, scars I'd earned clearing debris after a hurricane while she was busy redecorating this very room. "Lola," she whispered, her voice dripping with that performative motherly concern that always made my skin crawl. "I know your father put your name on those deeds, but he lived in that drafty wooden shack. He didn't understand what that kind of money actually means in the real world. Richard and I need this capital to keep the firm afloat. You are in the Army now. The government takes care of you for life, doesn't it? Don't be the selfish child who tears this family apart over something you don't even need." Her nails pressed harder into my scar. I looked at her, really looked at her, and saw the cold calculation behind her perfectly applied eyeliner. She wasn't seeing her daughter. She was seeing a line item on a balance sheet that needed to be erased. To her, my father's life's work was just capital for Richard's failing investments. I could feel the anger beginning to boil beneath my ribs, a slow-burning heat that threatened to melt the icy discipline I'd spent a decade building in the military. I thought about my father's workshop, the smell of sawdust, and the way he used to look at a piece of raw oak as if it held the secrets of the universe. He had left me that land because he knew I'd honor it. He knew I'd never sell it to build another row of soulless luxury condos. Richard chose that moment to yank the cork from a bottle of expensive red wine. The pop was dry and sharp, echoing through the room like a small-caliber gunshot. He poured the dark liquid into a crystal glass, his lip curling into a sneer. "She's just like her old man," he muttered, not even looking at me as he spoke to the lawyers. "Just like that carpenter, filthy, stubborn, and completely out of her depth." He took a sip of the wine, his eyes mocking me over the rim of the glass. The room felt like it was shrinking, the walls closing in as the five of them waited for me to break. For the selfish child to sign away her father's legacy just to make the discomfort go away. I didn't break. I slowly pulled my hand out from under my mother's grasp, feeling the ghost of her nails on my skin long after she let go. I didn't pick up the pen. Instead, I reached out and took the waiver. My fingers trembled slightly, not from fear, but from the sheer force of the adrenaline coursing through my veins. I folded the paper once, then twice, until it was a small, sharp-edged square. The edge of the paper caught the tip of my index finger, slicing a clean, stinging line through the skin. I watched a single drop of bright red blood bloom on the white surface of the document. It was the only honest thing in this entire room. I stood up, the chair screeching against the floorboards like a dying animal. The lawyers blinked, surprised by the sudden movement. Stephen started to say something, his hand reaching for the pen I'd left behind, but I didn't give him the chance. I tucked the blood-stained waiver into the chest pocket of my fatigues, right over my heart, and snapped the Velcro shut. The sound was loud and final in the silent room. I didn't say a word to Richard. I didn't look at the lawyers. I turned my gaze back to my mother, who was staring at me with a mixture of confusion and growing irritation. I didn't give her the satisfaction of seeing the tears that were stinging the back of my eyes. I just adjusted my uniform, clicked my heels together in a sharp military pivot, and walked toward the door. Every step I took across that rug was a rejection of their world. Behind me, the rhythmic tapping of Stevens's Mont Blanc pen started up again. Click, click, click. A persistent, demanding sound that followed me all the way out into the humid afternoon air. I didn't look back. I had the paper, I had the rules of engagement, and now I knew exactly who the enemy was. The rhythmic click of that Mont Blanc pen in my mother's living room didn't just annoy me. It triggered something deep, a sensory bridge that dragged me straight back to the winter of 1999. Back then, it wasn't the sound of a pen. It was the heavy final thud of a wooden gavel hitting a judge's bench in a sterile county courthouse. I was 7 years old, sitting on a hard wooden bench that made my legs ache, watching a brigade of lawyers in charcoal gray suits systematically dismantle my father's life. My father, Thomas, stood there with his back perfectly straight, wearing his old Army Class A uniform that had grown a bit tight around the shoulders. He was a combat engineer, a man who built bridges under fire, but he had no defense against the legal carpet bombing my mother had unleashed. I remember the smell of that courtroom, stale coffee and floor wax, and the way my father's calloused hands white-knuckled his garrison cap. The judge's voice was flat when he announced the verdict. Thomas Lane was losing the house. He was losing the woodworking shop he'd built with his own 2 hands, and most devastatingly, he was losing primary custody of me. When we walked out into the gravel parking lot, the gray Ohio sky felt like it was pressing down on my head. My father knelt in the grit, ignored the dust on his polished uniform, and used a thumb stained with cedar resin to wipe a smudge of mud off my knee. He didn't cry. He just looked me in the eyes and whispered that no matter what coordinates I found myself at, he would always be my fire support. Within a year, the fire support was replaced by Richard Porter and his silk blend suits. Richard didn't just move into our lives, he colonized them. One of the first things to go was the framed photo of me and my dad at the fishing pier that used to sit on the fireplace mantel. In its place appeared a professional portrait of the new family, Richard, my mother, and his daughter Melissa, taken at their exclusive golf club. Melissa was the golden child, the girl with the perfect blonde ringlets and the tiny Tiffany bracelets. I became a ghost in my own hallways, an invisible private as I'd later call it in my head. I remember Thanksgiving dinners that felt like a tactical interrogation. Richard would stand at the head of the long mahogany table, carving the turkey with surgical precision. He'd point the carving knife toward Melissa and tell the guests about her straight-A report card and her inevitable future at Harvard Law. My mother would lean against his shoulder, her eyes shining with reflected status, and then her gaze would flick to the corner of the table where I sat. She'd sigh, a small sound that carried the weight of 1,000 disappointments, and tell the guests that I was a result of a previous mistake. The clink of crystal glasses followed her words, a toast to a future I wasn't invited to. No one ever looked my way. I learned then that silence isn't just the absence of sound. It's a weapon they use to tell you that you don't exist. The favoritism wasn't just about words, it was strategic. On Melissa's 18th birthday, Richard made a grand show of tossing a set of keys onto the dinner table. They were for a brand new white BMW, the engine purring like a well-fed cat in the driveway. Melissa screamed and hugged him, the scent of her expensive perfume filling the room. That same afternoon, I was miles away at the post exchange on the local army base, wearing a stained apron that smelled of old grease and industrial degreaser. I was scrubbing the vents in the kitchen, my hands submerged in chemical-laden water until the skin on my knuckles went white and began to peel. I needed the money for textbooks, something Richard refused to pay for because manual labor would build character for a girl like me. I remember Richard actually pulled up to the PX that evening in his Mercedes to buy a box of premium cigars. He saw me behind the counter, my face flushed from the heat of the fryers. He didn't offer a ride home. He just tossed a crumpled $5 bill onto the counter as a tip, his lip curling in a sneer that made my blood run cold. He told the clerk, loud enough for me to hear, that I was just like my grease monkey father, destined to spend my life cleaning up other people's trash. I didn't say a word. I just took that $5 bill, smoothed out the wrinkles until the edges were perfectly straight, and tucked it into my pocket. It wasn't just money, it was fuel. My only act of open rebellion was my transcript. I poured every ounce of my frustration into my studies, especially math and physics. If they wanted me to be invisible, I'd be invisible behind a wall of perfect scores. Graduation day arrived with a humid Florida breeze that made the polyester of my gown itch. When I looked out at the front row, the seats reserved for the Porters were empty. They had flown down to Palm Beach for the weekend to celebrate Melissa's early acceptance to college. I stood there as the valedictorian for mathematics, listening to the principal call my name, and for a second, the loneliness felt like it was going to swallow me whole. But then I saw him. At the very back of the auditorium, standing near the exit sign, was a man in a faded brown canvas jacket. He was standing at attention, his posture as rigid as if he were on a parade deck. My father. He didn't cheer or make a scene. He just waited until the ceremony was over. When I found him in the parking lot, he didn't give me a bouquet of flowers or a Hallmark card. He reached into his jacket and handed me a heavy, thick brown envelope, the kind they use for construction blueprints, sealed shut with strips of black electrical tape. His voice was raspy, the sound of a man who'd spent too many years breathing in sawdust and disappointment. He told me it was the tuition for officer candidate school. He told me not to tell my mother. I felt the weight of that envelope against my chest, and for the first time in years, I didn't feel like a mistake. I felt like a soldier being handed her first set of orders. I know what it's like to feel like the black sheep in a family that only cares about the golden child. It wears you down, doesn't it? If you have ever had to work twice as hard just to prove you are half as good as someone who had everything handed to them on a silver platter, please hit the like button and subscribe. I'd love to hear from you in the comments. Just tell me one thing you did to survive a family that tried to make you feel small. Your story might be the fire support someone else needs today. 7:04 on a Tuesday morning at Fort Drum, New York. The air was a razor, -5 degrees of biting north country wind that turned my breath into frozen crystals before they even left my lungs. I was 3 miles into a 6-mile ruck, my heels digging into the frozen gravel of the perimeter road. Every step was a rhythmic crunch, a sound I'd grown to rely on to drown out the noise in my own head. I had a 40-pound pack strapped to my back, a lead-weight penance I carried for the crime of being born into the wrong family. 12 years since I'd left Westchester. 12 years of silence from that multi-million-dollar mansion. No Christmas cards ever reached my barracks. No happy birthday texts arrived after I finished my deployments in the sandbox of the Middle East. I had built a fortress out of army regulations and morning rucks, a defensive perimeter designed to keep the pain of being discarded from ever reaching the soft tissue of my heart. I thought I was invincible. I thought I was finally numb. Then my phone vibrated in my pocket. It was a violent, insistent buzz against my thigh, muffled by the thick plastic of my shock-proof OtterBox case. I didn't recognize the number. A Syracuse area code. I slowed my pace to a brisk walk, my lungs burning as I pulled the device out with gloved fingers. "Captain Lane," I said, my voice raspy from the cold. The voice on the other end was a low rumble, stained with the grit of 1,000 cheap cigarettes and decades of courtroom battles. "Lola, this is Colonel Harold Whitmore. I was a JAG officer with the 10th Mountain and a friend of your father's." He paused, and the silence that followed was heavier than the 40 pounds on my back. "I'm calling with a casualty notification. Your father, Thomas Lane, passed away from a massive myocardial infarction early Saturday morning." The world stopped spinning. The 40-pound ruck on my shoulders suddenly turned into 1,000 tons of solid concrete, crushing my lungs and pinning me to the asphalt. I dropped to my knees, the gravel tearing into the fabric of my fatigues, but I couldn't feel it. Saturday morning. The words echoed in my head like a malfunction on a firing range. "Saturday?" I managed to choke out, the air in my throat feeling like broken glass. "Today is Tuesday, Harold. Why am I just hearing this now?" I heard the scratch of a match on the other end, followed by a long, weary exhale. "Diane signed for the remains," Harold said, his voice dripping with a disgust he didn't try to hide. They held a private service on Sunday afternoon. Richard instructed the funeral home not to publish an obituary. He told the director that you were currently incommunicado on a classified mission and couldn't be reached. I bit my lower lip so hard I tasted iron, the hot metallic tang of blood filling my mouth. They didn't just take his house and his shop all those years ago. They had taken my final goodbye. They had turned my father's death into another one of their strategic exclusions, a way to erase my existence one last time. I sat there in the dirt of Fort Drum, a captain in the United States Army, feeling like that 7-year-old girl on the courthouse bench, watching her world burn while the lawyers adjusted their ties. I didn't cry. Soldiers are taught to process the mission first. "Where is he, Harold?" 4 hours later, I was standing in Harold's office in a strip mall outside of Syracuse. The room smelled like stale coffee, old paper, and the ghost of menthol tobacco. Harold was a big man, his skin like weathered leather, and he didn't offer me any platitudes. He just pushed a heavy steel lockbox across his oak desk. It was scarred and dented, a relic from my father's days as a sapper. "Thomas knew this day was coming," Harold said, tapping the lid. "He told me that if he fell, you were the only person authorized to hold these coordinates." He handed me a small slip of paper with a 6-digit code. I punched it in, the mechanical click sounding like a weapon being readied. Inside wasn't just old photos or memories, there were deeds. "He wasn't the poor carpenter your mother wanted the world to see," Harold grunted. "There's a commercial property on Maple Street and nearly $800,000 in cash and liquid assets. He spent 20 years living in that shack so he could build a wall of fire for you." But it was the item on top of the cash that made my breath hitch. A thick, cream-colored envelope sealed with a heavy dollop of red wax. It was identical to the one he'd handed me at my graduation. "He was very specific about that one," Harold whispered, leaning back in his creaky chair. "He told me, tell Lola to only break that seal when they have her in their sights, when they think they've finally won. She'll know when it's time to pull the trigger. I picked up the envelope. The wax was cold and hard against my thumb. I could feel the thickness of the paper inside, a hidden weight that felt like a loaded magazine. My mother and Richard thought they had buried the last of Thomas Lane's legacy on Sunday afternoon. They thought they could use his death to finally cut the last thread connecting me to their world. They had no idea that Thomas Lane was a combat engineer. He didn't just build bridges, he knew exactly how to wire them for demolition. I tucked the envelope into my jacket, right over my heart. What was inside this second envelope? What explosive did my father leave behind to level the Porter mansion? I slammed the heavy door of the Porter mansion behind me, the sound of luxury turning its back on me, echoing in the humid afternoon air. I climbed into the cab of my 2012 Ford F-15. Oh, the leather of the driver's seat cracked and worn, smelling of old coffee and gun oil. It was the only place where I didn't feel like a target. I turned the ignition, and the engine rumbled to life with a familiar, comforting vibration that traveled up through the steering wheel and into my bones. I didn't head back to the base. I drove straight toward the outskirts of Syracuse, leaving behind the gated communities and the manicured lawns for the industrial grit of the valley. My destination was VFW, Post 3146. It sat on a gravel lot where the asphalt had long ago given up the fight against the winter frost. The heavy oak door of the post creaked and groaned as I pushed my way inside, the sound of 1,000 Friday nights etched into its hinges. The air hit me like a physical weight, a thick, nostalgic fog of Milwaukee's best beer, decades of stale cigar smoke, and the faint, sweet scent of industrial floor cleaner. It was a smell that would have disgusted my mother, but to me, it smelled like honesty. In the dim light of the bar, I saw Colonel Harold Whitmore sitting at the far end of the mahogany counter, the glow of his cigar an orange ember in the shadows. Surrounded by him were 6 men in faded canvas jackets and worn ball caps, their sleeves rolled up to reveal tattoos of anchors, crossed rifles, and the castle insignia of the Corps of Engineers. They were the men who had built the bridges my father once defended. When they saw me, the rhythmic tapping of their shot glasses against the wood stopped instantly. Harold didn't stand up, but he pulled out a heavy oak bar stool and pointed to it with a nod of his head. Nobody was sitting in the spot next to him, but there was already a glass sitting there, a double shot of bourbon, filled to the very brim, the amber liquid catching the light from the neon Budweiser sign behind the bar. That is Thomas's spot. A silver-haired veteran with 3 fingers missing from his left hand said in a voice that sounded like gravel in a blender. He pushed a second glass toward me. I took off my boots, resting my feet on the brass rail, and felt the tension in my shoulders begin to ebb away. These men didn't wear Tom Ford suits or use legal jargon to hide their intentions. They just raised their glasses in a silent, synchronized motion toward a Polaroid of my father, framed with black electrical tape and pinned to the mirror. They didn't need to say they were sorry. They were showing me that he still existed here. I pulled my phone out of my fatigue pocket, the screen a cold, black mirror. I checked for notifications, but there was a deafening silence from my biological family. There were no missed calls from Diane asking if I was okay after the ambush in her living room. No text from Melissa. Instead, a notification popped up from a Facebook post by my Aunt Linda. It was a photo of my mother looking distraught on a velvet sofa, captioned with a plea for prayers for poor Diane because of her disloyal and greedy daughter. I flipped the phone face down on the beer-stained wood, the weight of the social media shaming feeling like a dirty film on my skin. In the Porter mansion, I was a debt to be settled, a mistake to be erased. But here, among the welders, the mechanics, and the retired sappers who spoke in profanities and lived on pensions, I was simply Thomas Lane's daughter. The contrast was a jagged pill to swallow. My own mother had tried to trick me into signing away my birthright while my father was barely cold in the ground. Yet these strangers were guarding his memory like it was their own. Harold placed his hand on my shoulder, his grip heavy and rough, the calluses of a lifetime of labor pressing through the fabric of my jacket. It was the first time since I'd received the news that I felt like I wasn't standing on a collapsing bridge. "Richard is already filing paperwork with the Onondaga County Probate Court," Harold said, his voice low and tactical. "They are going to use their bank accounts to drag this out, Lola. They want to bury you in legal fees until you are bankrupt and forced to crawl back to them for mercy." I reached into my chest pocket and felt the cold, hard red wax on the envelope my father had left me. I gripped my glass of bourbon so tight my knuckles turned a ghostly white, the anger finally burning through the last of my grief. I looked around the room at the men standing with me, my found family, and realized that while the porters had the money, I had the fire support. The veterans at the bar collectively knocked the bottoms of their glasses against the counter in a sharp, thunderous beat. Thump, thump, thump. A sound of solidarity that drowned out the hum of the air conditioner. Just as the sound faded, my phone, lying face down on the wood, let out a sharp, high-pitched ping that cut through the silence like a sniper's bullet. It was a message that would change the rules of engagement forever. The 48 hours following my exit from the VFW post felt like a sustained artillery barrage directed at my very soul. It started with Aunt Linda. She tagged me in a public post that went viral among our extended family in upstate New York, claiming that the hero soldier was actually a common thief trying to steal her own mother's retirement funds. Then came the voicemails from Uncle Robert, his voice thick with bourbon and self-righteousness, calling me an ungrateful brat who didn't deserve to wear the uniform. They were using the cover of Family Values to launch a full-scale smear campaign, hoping to isolate me until I cracked under the weight of the social shame. I didn't respond. I just watched the notifications pile up like body counts on a tactical map, my jaw set in a hard, straight line. On Friday morning, a text from my mother's number lit up the screen. "Meet us at the Denny's off I-81. Let's settle this like adults. Otherwise, Richard will be taking this matter directly to your commanding officer." I pushed through the heavy glass doors of the Denny's, the jingle of the cheap bells above the frame sounding like a warning siren in my ears. The air inside was heavy and stagnant, a nauseating mix of old fryer grease and that chemical lemon-scented cleaner they used to hide the grime of 1,000 midnight shifts. Richard and Diane were already there, tucked into a corner booth with cracked red vinyl seats that looked like they hadn't been replaced since the 90s. Richard was tapping his heavy gold signet ring against the Formica tabletop. Thump, thump, thump. A rhythmic, demanding sound that set my teeth on edge and made the muscles in my neck tighten. I slid into the opposite seat and crossed my arms, my spine rigid against the plastic backing. A waitress with a tired, hollow expression slid a cup of black coffee in front of me without a word. It was burnt, the bitter, acrid steam hitting my face like a physical insult. Richard leaned forward, his breath a foul mix of artificial lemon syrup and the lingering stench of a stale cigar. "We know about the steel box, Lola," he hissed, his eyes narrowing into cold slits. "You really think you're just going to walk away with $800,000 of family money?" My mother reached for a cheap paper napkin, dabbing at the corners of her eyes, even though they were as dry as a desert floor. "Lola, for 20 years, I've been the one paying for everything while you were off playing soldier," she whimpered, her voice carrying that practiced tremor she used whenever she wanted to manipulate a situation. "I paid for Melissa's school, I paid the insurance. Now the house is under a second mortgage because of Richard's firm. That money Thomas hid, it was supposed to be mine from the divorce. He cheated me out of it." She looked at me, her gaze a desperate blend of greed and hollow entitlement. "Are you really going to be the reason your own mother ends up on the street?" I felt the heat of the coffee cup through my gloves, a slow burn that matched the fire growing in my chest. "The court settled those property rights in 1999, Diane," I said, my voice flat and cold as a winter morning at Fort Drum. "The name on the deed and the trust is Lola Lane. My father didn't cheat you. He just made sure you couldn't throw away his life's work on Richard's failing investments." Richard's face turned a violent, mottled shade of purple, the veins in his neck bulging like thick cords. He swung his hand across the table, knocking over the salt and pepper shakers with a sharp, echoing clatter that made the couple in the next booth jump. "Don't you dare quote the law to me, you little brat!" he roared, attracting stares from the truckers sitting at the counter. "Your father was a pathetic little grease monkey, a rat who crawled into a wooden hole and stole from his wife just to buy a piece of dirt." He leaned in even closer, his finger poking the air just inches from my nose. Sign the transfer papers today, or I'll have your military career shredded before Monday morning. I know people at the Pentagon who don't like hero stories with dirty family endings. I slammed my coffee cup down onto the porcelain saucer, the dark liquid splashing across the table and soaking into his expensive silk cuff. I reached into my pocket, pulled out a crumpled $5 bill, and threw it directly into the puddle of coffee. I stood up, kicking my metal chair back so hard it screeched against the tile floor like a dying animal. "Get a good lawyer, Richard," I said, my heart hammering against my ribs with a focused, tactical fury. "Because I'm not just defending a piece of land anymore. I'm defending the memory of a man you weren't man enough to even stand next to." I walked out of that Denny's without looking back, the cheap bell above the door jinging one last time like a taunt. Behind me, I could hear Richard's muffled shouting and the frantic, clumsy scraping of his own chair as he tried to stand. My hands were shaking, not with fear, but with a cold, absolute clarity I hadn't felt since I first earned my bars. The found family at the VFW had warned me that the Porters would fight dirty, but I hadn't realized how much they enjoyed wallowing in the mud. I climbed back into the cab of my truck and gripped the steering wheel until my knuckles turned a ghostly white. The tactical retreat was officially over. Now, it was time to go on the offensive. I thought about the cold red wax seal on the envelope tucked safely in my chest pocket. My father had told me I'd know when it was time to pull the trigger. As I shifted the F-150 into gear and pulled onto the highway, watching the Denny's disappear in my rearview mirror, I knew that time was right now. Monday morning arrived with a heavy, oppressive silence that usually precedes a major storm. The screeching sound of that metal chair at the diner was still ringing in my ears, a jagged echo of the moment I finally walked away from Richard and Diane. I was standing at attention in Major Henderson's office, my heels snapped together and my spine as rigid as a structural beam. Henderson didn't look up immediately. He sat behind a massive oak desk, the kind that had seen decades of military bureaucracy, lit by the harsh, flickering glow of overhead fluorescent lights. He finally tossed a thin manila folder onto the blotter. The sound it made was light, almost insignificant, but it felt like a grenade landing between us. "Captain Lane," he said, his voice flat and professional. "The Provost Marshal's office just received a formal fax from a civilian attorney named Stevens. They are alleging that you are exploiting the cognitive decline of a senior citizen to illegally seize real estate and liquid assets. They have requested an internal military investigation into your conduct." My throat went bone dry, the kind of thirst that no amount of canteen water can fix. I felt the blood drain from my face, replaced by a cold, tingling numbness. Richard hadn't been bluffing. He wasn't just coming for the money anymore, he was coming for my livelihood. He was trying to tear the very fabric of my uniform. I looked straight ahead at the cinder block wall behind Henderson, focusing on a small crack in the paint to keep my breathing steady. Henderson took off his sunglasses and rubbed the bridge of his nose, looking tired. "I've known you since the dust of Kandahar, Lola, and I know your record is impeccable. But the Army doesn't take kindly to officers being accused of financial elder abuse, even if it is a family squabble. If this proceeds to a formal investigation, your security clearance will be suspended immediately. You know what that signifies for an engineer officer. It means you are grounded. It means your career hits a wall. You need to clean up this mess, Captain, before it lands on the general's desk." I snapped a sharp salute, the motion crisp and mechanical. "Yes, sir," I replied. As I turned and walked out into the echoing concrete hallway, the anger in my veins wasn't a slow burn anymore. It was a high-pressure steam pipe about to burst. They weren't just greedy, they were predatory. They were trying to erase the only thing I had built for myself. By 2100 that night, the barracks were quiet, filled only with the distant hum of the ventilation system and the occasional sound of a heavy door closing down the hall. I was sitting on the edge of my steel-framed bunk, the thin mattress offering no comfort. I pulled the heavy brown envelope out of my wall locker. The red wax seal on the back was thick and dark, looking like a dried wound in the dim light. I hesitated for a fraction of a second, my father's face flashing in my mind. The way he looked at my graduation, standing by the exit like he didn't belong. Then I slid my thumb under the wax and pressed upward. The sound was a sharp, brittle crack. The red seal shattered, tiny flakes of wax falling onto my olive-drab blanket like droplets of dried blood. I pulled out a stack of yellowed papers and a small black USB drive. On top of the stack was a yellow sticky note with my father's familiar, shaky handwriting. The ink was faded, but the message was a punch to the gut. It said, "In 2001, Diane threatened to file a false report of child abuse against me if I didn't sign over the woodworking shop and the house equity to her. She knew a report like that would end my time with you forever. I backed down to protect you, Lola. I let her take it all so I could keep seeing my daughter. But this time, don't you dare back down. You are a soldier now. Fight for what's yours." I felt a cold chill wash over me as the puzzle pieces of my childhood finally locked into place. All those years, I thought he was just a man who had lost his way. In reality, he was a man who had been held hostage by a woman who used his love for me as a ransom. I walked over to my desk and plugged the USB drive into my laptop. My hands were steady, but my jaw was clenched so tight I could feel the pulse thrumming in my temples. A single audio file appeared on the screen, dated November 2001. I hit play. The recording was grainy, filled with the hiss of an old tape deck, but the voices were unmistakable. I heard my father's voice, quiet and pleading, followed by my mother's voice, sharp, shrill, and dripping with a malice I had only ever glimpsed in the shadows. "Just sign the damn papers, Thomas," she hissed. "If you don't, I will call the police and tell them you put your hands on Lola. I will make sure you rot in a cell and never see her face again. You think anyone will believe a grease monkey like you over me? You're nothing." The audio cut off with a click, leaving me in a silence that felt like a vacuum. The woman who had just called me greedy at a diner had been a blackmailer for 2 decades. She hadn't just taken his money, she had stolen his dignity and used me as the weapon to do it. The transition from victim to predator happened in a heartbeat. I didn't feel the resentment anymore. I felt the cold, tactical clarity that comes right before a breach. My father had spent his life wiring this bridge, and now he had handed me the detonator. I reached for my phone, the screen glowing brightly in the dark room. I opened the encrypted chat with Colonel Harold Whitmore. My thumb hovered over the keyboard for a second, then I typed a single word in all caps: execute. I hit the send button, the small whoosh of the sent message sounding like the first shot of a war. They wanted to attack my career. They wanted to take my father's land. They wanted to play dirty. Fine, I was a combat engineer. I was trained to find the weak points in a structure and bring the whole thing down. I am done playing by their rules. They tried to take my honor, the one thing I earned on my own. Have you ever been pushed so far that the only choice left was to burn the bridge they were standing on? Please hit the like button and subscribe to see how I take them down. Also, leave a comment with the word justice. If you believe a mother who uses her own child as a weapon deserves what is coming to her. I want to know I am not the only one who has had to fight this kind of war. 6 o'clock on a Tuesday morning. The air in Colonel Harold Whitmore's warehouse office was thick with the scent of stale cigar smoke and old paper, the kind of heavy atmosphere that settles in a place where hard truths are processed. Harold didn't bother with greetings. He simply spread 3 manila folders across the scarred metal tabletop with the practiced precision of a man laying out a tactical map. The first file was the heavy artillery, a medical evaluation from the Syracuse VA hospital. It was dated just 8 weeks before my father passed away. Harold tapped a thick finger on the conclusion written by a Dr. Morrison. Patient Thomas Lane is 100% lucid, possessing full civil and mental capacity. My mother and Richard had been banking on the dementia narrative to invalidate the will, but this document turned their primary weapon into a dud. The second folder was even more damning. It contained a 47-page printout of every vitriolic text message, every social media slur, and every recorded voicemail Richard and Diane had unleashed over the last week. It included the receipt for the fraudulent fax they sent to my command. Harold bit down on the end of his unlit cigar, his eyes reflecting a cold, legal satisfaction. "We have them by the throat, Captain," he grunted. They think they're playing a game of chess. They don't realize we've already mapped the entire board. But the real intel didn't come from a file. It came from a defector. At 19:30 that evening, a white BMW pulled into the far corner of the Walmart parking lot, its headlights cutting through the gray drizzle of a Syracuse spring. It idled next to my F-150, looking like a piece of expensive jewelry dropped in a gravel pit. The driver's side window slid down, and the smell of cold, stale cigarette smoke drifted into my cab. Melissa Porter, the golden child who had been the centerpiece of every Porter family portrait, looked like she was vibrating apart. She pulled off her oversized designer sunglasses, revealing eyes that were red-rimmed, her mascara smeared into dark streaks down her cheeks. Her hands were white-knuckled on the leather-wrapped steering wheel, her acrylic nails clicking rhythmically against the rim. Click, click, click. A frantic hollow sound. She wouldn't look at me. She just stared through the windshield at the flickering neon Walmart sign. "Richard is losing his mind, Lola," she whispered, her voice cracking under the weight of a secret she couldn't carry anymore. The perfect Porter life was a house of cards, and the wind was starting to blow. She told me about the third mortgage Richard had taken out on the Westchester mansion to fund a commercial development that turned out to be nothing more than a high-stakes Ponzi scheme. The bank was moving in. They were weeks away from foreclosure, weeks away from being exposed as the frauds they were. They didn't just want my father's $800,000, they needed it to keep the illusion alive for one more month. The scent of her desperation was more pungent than the cigarettes. She told me about the previous night, the half-empty bottle of Jack Daniels on the coffee table, the sound of the 60-inch television shattering when Richard threw a crystal decanter through the screen. She described him screaming that he would burn the damn grease monkey's shack on Maple Street to the ground before he let me take a single cent of his money. I listened to her with the cold, detached focus of an engineer evaluating a structural failure. This was the fake wealth of the American middle class, a life built on credit, lies, and the exploitation of the weak. I reached into my wallet, pulled out a crisp $100 bill, and flicked it through the window onto her lap. "Fill up your tank and get out of that house, Melissa," I said, my voice as flat as a dial tone. "The demolition starts on Saturday." She didn't thank me. She just rolled up the window and peeled out of the parking lot, her tires splashing through the puddles. I climbed back into my truck and sat in the dark for a moment, the only sound being the rain drumming against the roof. I reached for the Bluetooth dial on my dashboard and dialed Harold's number. It rang 3 times before he picked up. "Colonel," I said, my eyes fixed on the red wax seal of the envelope still sitting on my passenger seat. "We aren't waiting for a probate court summons. Richard is unstable. He's a threat to the property." I felt a surge of cold, tactical adrenaline. "Saturday afternoon, 1400. We're taking the fight to their living room. Bring every piece of firepower we've collected. It's time to end this." I shifted the truck into gear, the heavy clunk of the transmission sounding like a bolt being slid home. I flicked on the windshield wipers, and they began to sweep across the glass with a sharp, rhythmic hiss. Shh, thump, shh, thump, scraping away the grime and the rain. As I pulled out onto the main road, the sound of those wipers filled the cab, a relentless mechanical rhythm that felt like a countdown. The Porters thought they could bury me in their silence and their lies. They thought the selfish child would never fight back. They had no idea that I wasn't just my father's daughter. I was a student of the rules of engagement. I knew exactly where to place the charges to make sure the entire hypocritical structure came down in one clean, thunderous collapse. As I drove toward the base, the sound of the wipers ritting against the glass stayed with me, a sound that would soon be replaced by the finality of a folder being slammed onto a glass table. The target was locked. The coordinates were set. It was exactly 1400 on Saturday when I stepped back into the Porter living room. The air conditioning was still humming at a steady 68 degrees, but the atmosphere felt entirely different this time. I wasn't the prey anymore. I was the one setting the perimeter. The 3 civil lawyers were still entrenched on that Italian leather sofa, looking like they hadn't moved since our last encounter. Stevens, the man who had tried to play God with my father's legacy, didn't even look up from his tablet. He just adjusted his glasses and slid a fresh copy of the waiver of inheritance rights toward the edge of the glass table. He told me they had the probate filing ready and that if I didn't sign, they would drag me through 5 years of litigation that would bankrupt me long before I ever saw a dime. He spoke with a smug, bored authority, as if my defeat was already a historical fact. My mother sat next to him, her face a mask of practiced distress, while Richard stood by the fireplace, swirling a fresh glass of red wine with a sneer that said he'd already won. I didn't answer Stevens. I didn't even look at the pen. I just stood there, my feet planted in a solid military stance, and listened to the heavy, rhythmic thud of a vehicle door closing outside. A moment later, the front door swung open and Colonel Harold Whitmore stepped in. He didn't ask for permission. He walked into that room like a tank entering a garden party, carrying a black leather briefcase that had seen more battles than all 3 of those civilian lawyers combined. He dropped the briefcase on the glass tabletop with a heavy, explosive sound that made the crystal wine glasses rattle and go silent. He didn't offer a handshake or a name. He just looked at Stevens and told him we needed to talk about fraud. Harold didn't waste time with opening statements. He snapped open the latches of his briefcase and pulled out the first folder, the medical records from the Syracuse VA hospital. He slammed it down directly on top of the waiver Stevens had been pushing. He told them, in that voice that sounded like grinding stones, that Thomas Lane had been certified 100% lucid and mentally competent just weeks before his death. He looked Stevens dead in the eye and told him that any attempt to claim cognitive decline in court would result in an immediate criminal investigation for the falsification of medical evidence. I watched the color drain from Stevens's face, his professional composure crumbling as he frantically flipped through the pages with the red official seals. He wasn't looking at me anymore. He was looking at a career-ending scandal. Then came the second strike, the faxes. Harold pulled out the stack of documents Richard had sent to Fort Drum, the ones meant to shred my reputation and get me grounded. Harold's tone turned ice cold. He informed the room that interfering with the chain of command and sabotaging the career of an active-duty federal officer was a felony. I watched a dark patch of sweat begin to pool under the armpits of Stevens's expensive dress shirt. Richard tried to mutter something about family business, but Harold shut him down with a single word: conspiracy. The lawyers were realizing they weren't in a civil negotiation anymore. They were in a kill zone. But I was the one who delivered the final blow. I reached into the chest pocket of my fatigues and pulled out the digital recorder, the small red light blinking like a heartbeat in the silent room. My mother stood up, her voice shrill and desperate, telling me to get out of her house. I didn't move. I just hit play. The recording from 2001 filled the room, the grainy hiss of the old tape unable to hide the venom in her voice as she blackmailed my father, using my own childhood as a ransom for his woodworking shop. The recording played to the end, her threats echoing off the high ceilings and the expensive art. The silence that followed was absolute, heavy enough to drown in. My mother collapsed back into her chair, her face looking old and hollow for the first time in my life. The collapse happened fast. Stevens didn't even look at Diane or Richard. He just started frantically stuffing his papers back into his briefcase, his hands shaking so much he dropped his Mont Blanc pen on the floor. He told Diane that their representation agreement was terminated effectively immediately and that he wouldn't be answering any further calls. He and the other 2 lawyers scrambled for the door, the sound of their briefcases snapping shut. Click, click, sounding like a retreat. Richard was fuming, his eyes wild with a mixture of terror and unbridled rage. He grabbed a heavy crystal vase from the mantel, his knuckles white, and for a second I thought he was actually going to throw it at my head. Harold didn't move a muscle, but he shifted the side of his jacket just enough to show the black grip of his Glock in its holster. Richard froze, the vase still clutched in his shaking hands, his breath coming in ragged, ugly gasps. I didn't feel the need to shout or gloat. I just felt a deep, quiet sense of relief, as if a weight I'd been carrying for 20 years had finally been lifted. I looked at my mother one last time. She wasn't a monster anymore. She was just a small, greedy woman who had lost everything because she couldn't understand the value of the man she'd married. I snapped my heels together in a sharp, military pivot, the sound of my boots against the hardwood floor final and decisive. I walked out of that mansion for the last time, Harold following a few steps behind me. I didn't look back to see Richard's face or Diane's tears. I grabbed the heavy oak handle of the front door and pulled it shut behind me. The sound of the door slamming into the frame echoed through the driveway, a thunderous, mechanical end to the battle. It was exactly 3:07 on a Sunday morning, that dead hour where the suburbs of Syracuse feel like they are held together by nothing but silence and the hum of distant power lines. I was sitting in the cab of my F-150, parked 3 blocks away from the old wooden house on Maple Street. The only light in the truck came from the pale, flickering blue glow of my laptop sitting on the passenger seat, reflecting off the steel of my tactical watch. On the screen, 4 infrared camera feeds pulsed with a grainy, ghostly light. My father had installed them years ago, tucked deep under the eaves of the house where the shadows were thickest and the angles were best. He was a sapper, a combat engineer who believed that every bridge he built was a potential target and every home he owned was a fortress in waiting. Melissa's warning had been a direct hit. Through the digital eyes of the cameras, I watched a black SUV crawl down the street with its headlights killed, looking like a predator belly crawling through the high grass of a combat zone. It drifted to a stop right in front of my father's white picket fence. 2 figures emerged from the shadows of the vehicle. Even in the distorted infrared light, I recognized the gait. Richard was carrying 2 heavy plastic fuel cans, his movements jagged and frantic. Diane followed behind him, her hand shielding a small flashlight covered with a black rag. On the monitor, I watched Richard unscrew the cap of the first can. He didn't hesitate for a single second. He began pouring the dark, shimmering liquid across the oak porch, the very spot where I had spent my childhood summers sitting on his lap, learning how to plane cedar and drive nails straight. Even from 3 blocks away, I could almost taste the acrid, overwhelming stench of high-octane gasoline soaking into the dry, thirsty grain of the timber. Diane moved to the side, splashing the fuel against the window frames with a desperate, jerky motion. They were standing on a piece of history worth over $500,000, and they were ready to turn it into a funeral pyre just to make sure I couldn't claim a single square inch of it. My heart was hammering against my ribs, a steady tactical beat that demanded I move, but I held my position. I didn't reach for my phone to dial 911 immediately. I had promised my father I would protect what he left behind, and he had given me the tools to do it without ever having to draw a weapon. I placed my fingers on the keyboard, my breath hitching in my throat as I watched Richard step back onto the wet grass, his silhouette sharp against the dark house. Richard reached into his pocket and pulled out a box of matches. He struck one against the bottom of his shoe, the tiny flare of orange light illuminating his face on my screen. He was smiling, a jagged, monstrous expression of pure, unadulterated spite that made my skin crawl and my stomach turn. He held the flame for a long second, savoring the moment of destruction, before he flicked it toward the puddle of gasoline on the porch. I didn't wait for the match to land. I hit the enter key with a final, decisive strike. In an instant, the passive defense system my father had wired into the main plumbing line roared to life. 6 industrial-grade high-pressure water cannons, hidden behind the decorative rafters of the porch, exploded with a sound like a jet engine at takeoff. The match was extinguished before it even hit the first drop of fuel. The sheer force of the water hit Richard like a physical blow from a riot squad, slamming him backward into the mud with enough pressure to knock the air out of his lungs. Diane screamed as she lost her footing on the slick, water-slicked porch, her knees hitting the wet wood with a sickening, hollow thud. They weren't arsonists anymore. They were just 2 drowning rats trapped in a storm of their own making. The silence of the night was shredded a few seconds later by the wail of sirens. I had timed the dispatch perfectly, knowing exactly how long it would take for the Syracuse Police Department to roll from the station 2 miles away. 3 cruisers tore around the corner, their blue and red lights flashing rhythmically against the wet maple trees and the white siding of the neighboring houses. I closed my laptop, the blue light disappearing as I stepped out of my truck into the cold night air. As I walked toward the front yard, the smell of gasoline was thick enough to make my eyes water and my throat burn. The police already had Richard pinned face down in a soup of mud and fuel. He was sputtering and gasping, his expensive silk shirt ruined and plastered to his skin, as an officer pulled his arms behind his back. I heard the cold metallic click of the steel handcuffs as they ratcheted shut around his wrists, a sound of absolute, undeniable finality. Diane was crouching on the grass, her hands over her face, wailing in a way that sounded more like a cornered animal than a mother. She looked up as I approached, her heavy mascara running down her cheeks in dark, ugly streaks that made her look like a ghost. She tried to say my name, to pull one last string of family guilt. But I just looked past her at the house. The oak was soaked, but it was still standing. The Sapper had won. I turned my back on them and walked toward the lead officer, not feeling a single shred of the old bitterness. The war was over, and for the first time in 20 years, I could finally breathe. 6 months is a long time in the civilian world, but in the Army it is just another training cycle. The legal battle that felt like a lifetime is finally over. Actually, the dust did not just settle, it was buried. Richard is currently sitting in a cell in upstate New York, serving 10 years for first-degree arson and insurance fraud. It turns out that when you try to burn down a house with 6 high-pressure water cannons aimed at your face, the evidence is pretty hard to dispute. Diane got 5 years of probation and lost her real estate license for good. The bank moved in on the Westchester mansion faster than a tactical squad. Truth be told, I did not feel much when I heard the news. My phone was a war zone for a few weeks, though. Aunt Linda and Uncle Robert started calling and leaving these long, sobbing voicemails about how they had been misled and how we are still family. I did not say a word back. I just blocked every single one of them. You know, there is a point where an apology is just noise, and I had reached it. I was done being the target for their cheap drama. I finally set a boundary that no one was going to cross again. I spent my first Saturday of freedom at the Maple Street house. The air was crisp and the morning sun was cutting through the tall oaks in the backyard in long golden spears. I walked into my father's old woodworking shop and just stood there for a minute. The place was thick with the scent of old pine resin and the dry metallic tang of well-oiled tools. Dust motes were dancing in the light beams, and for the first time in 20 years, the silence did not feel heavy. It felt like an invitation. Colonel Harold had already transferred the $180,000 in liquid assets into my account, but I was not there for the money. I walked over to the heavy workbench in the corner and knelt down on the concrete floor. I reached far back under the frame and pulled out a small oak box. It was gray with age and had a simple rusted iron latch. No codes, no wax seals, just a piece of wood that my father had put together with his own hands. I pushed the latch up and the hinges gave a slow, dry creak that sounded like a long, exhaled breath. I did not find stacks of hundreds or gold coins inside. Instead, the box was filled to the brim with Polaroid photos. They were all tied together in neat bundles with olive drab military cord. I sat back on my heels and started untying the first bundle. My hands were actually shaking a little. These were not family vacation photos. I picked up the first one and felt the rough plastic edge of the paper. It was a shot of the post exchange at Fort Benning taken from across the street. In the grainy image, I could see a girl in a greasy apron scrubbing the vents. It was me at 18. I flipped it over and saw my father's shaky handwriting in black ink. It said, Syracuse 2008. Proud of you for not asking that man for a dime. I moved to the next one. It was a photo of me at my commissioning ceremony taken from the very back row of the auditorium. It was blurry, but I could see my face as I took the oath. The note on the back just said Captain Lane. You look like a leader. I felt a lump form in my throat that made it hard to swallow. There were hundreds of them, photos of me coming home from my first deployment, photos of my truck parked in the driveway of my first apartment, photos of me just walking down the street in my uniform. He had been there for every single heartbeat. He was the shadow at the back of the room and the stranger across the street. He had spent his entire life following me from a distance, making sure I was standing tall, even when he could not be close enough to hold my hand. The last photo in the box was a shot of me standing on the porch of the Maple Street house the day after he died. He must have left instructions for Harold to take it. On the back it said, Kandahar 2018. Come home safe, my private, and Syracuse 2022. My daughter never backs down. He had never abandoned me. He had spent 20 years being my silent fire support from the tree line. The sun was getting higher and the shop was starting to warm up. I could feel the heat on my neck as I carefully put the photos back into the oak box. I realized then that my mother and Richard were never the real story. They were just the obstacles in the way of a much bigger truth. I looked at the piles of sawdust on the floor and the old tools hanging on the wall. My father was a sapper in his own way. He knew that life was full of minefields, and he spent his final years making sure I had the map to get through them. The army taught me how to find an IED in the dirt, but Thomas Lane taught me how to clear the explosives from my own soul. He taught me that being strong does not mean being loud. It means being the one who is still standing when the smoke clears. I stood up and grabbed an old broom made of stiff straw leaning in the corner. I started sweeping the floor, moving the dry curls of wood and the gray dust toward the door. Each stroke of the broom felt like I was clearing away the last 20 years of resentment and lies. I was not the mistake my mother called me, and I was not the grease monkey's brat that Richard sneered at. I was a captain in the United States Army, and I was the daughter of a man who loved me enough to stay in the shadows so I could learn how to find my own light. I finished sweeping and pushed the pile of dust out into the yard. I stepped out of the shop and let the heavy oak doors swing shut behind me. I did not lock it. There was no need to hide anything anymore. I walked out into the middle of the sun-drenched yard and took a deep breath of the Syracuse air. It tasted like pine and fresh starts. I was finally done with the war, and for the first time in my life, I knew exactly who I was and where I was going. The story of Lola Lane serves as a powerful reminder that our worth is never defined by those who fail to see it. True strength is not found in the approval of a toxic family, but in the courage to build a life on your own terms. Lola's journey from a discarded child to a resilient captain shows us that setting firm boundaries is not an act of malice, but an essential act of self-preservation. When we stop seeking fire support from those who are actively trying to sabotage us, we finally create the space to find our true allies and reclaim our peace. Now the Creator wants to hear from you. Many of us have walked through our own family minefields and had to decide when to stay and when to cut the cord for good. Have you ever had to choose your own mental health over the expectations of your blood relatives? Have you found your own version of the VFW post? A place where you are finally seen for who you truly are. Please share your story or simply comment the word boundary below to let us know you are standing tall. If Lola's victory moved you today, make sure to hit the like button and subscribe to join our community of resilient storytellers.